Cross-section, B-17 Flying Fortress. Origins. The B-17 began development far before the outbreak of hostilities. In the 1930s, the Army Air Corps was in need of a large four-engine bomber, one that could be called to America's defense if an enemy fleet was to invade from a distant corner such as Hawaii, Alaska, or Panama. To this end, the aircraft company Boeing created the first prototype as early as 1935. In 1937, there was a limited production run, so by the time the U.S. entered the conflict in 1941, there was already a small but growing fleet of the aircraft. The name Flying Fortress came from a reporter who in 1935 exclaimed that the prototype looked like a flying fortress after seeing the multiple machine guns on the craft. Variants and numbers. Over the years, the basic design of the B-17 was upgraded multiple times. After the Model 299, the first prototype, the first to go into significant production was the B-17B, which first flew in 1939. During the war, the Flying Fortress was modified multiple times, with improvements such as more defensive guns, more powerful engines, and many other features to improve performance. The B-17G is considered to be the definitive variant of the Flying Fortress, with over 8,600 manufactured before production ended. Altogether, around 12,700 of all variants were made, mostly by Boeing, but also by manufacturers Douglas Aircraft and Vega, which was a subsidiary of Lockheed. In addition to its role as a bomber, there were several other patterns that were devised using the B-17's frame. These included an escort version, the YB-40, which was armed with extra machine guns and was intended to escort other B-17s before the introduction of long-range fighter aircraft. The C-108, a cargo plane, the F-9 reconnaissance aircraft, among many others. Dimensions. The B-17G measured in at 74 feet 9 inches in length, with a wingspan of just under 104 feet and a height of 19 feet 1 inch. It weighed in at 36,000 pounds unloaded, though this can increase to upwards of 65,000 pounds with a full bomb load, machine guns, ammunition, and other additions. The Flying Fortress was made from aluminum, which was much lighter than steel, saving on valuable weight. Performance. The B-17G was propelled by 4 Wright Cyclone R-1820 9-cylinder engines, each one capable of producing 1,200 horsepower. The top speed of the Flying Fortress was 300 miles per hour, though this was rarely done, with typical cruising speed of around 170 to 200 miles per hour. The service ceiling was 35,000 feet. The B-17 was a long-range bomber and had a large 2,800-gallon fuel tank, giving the Fortress a range of around 2,000 miles, though this can vary greatly depending on the bomb load, weather conditions, and numerous other factors. Armament. As a bomber, the B-17G had a typical payload of 6,000 pounds of bombs, though this can be increased to 8,000 pounds depending on the type of ordnance being carried. In some cases, external bomb racks were fitted to the fuselage, increasing the payload to over 17,000 pounds, though this greatly reduced the operational range and was rarely performed. To protect the bomber, the B-17G was fitted with 12 50-caliber machine guns fitted around the fuselage. These were a machine gun mounted each on the left and right side of the nose, in the cheek of the bomber, a pair of remote-controlled guns in a chin turret, twin guns in a dorsal turret, a pair of waist gunners with a single machine gun each, a pair in the ball turret underneath the fuselage, and a pair utilized by the tail gunner. An additional 13th gun could also be located in an auxiliary turret behind the dorsal turret. Since space and weight were limited, each gun had a small supply of ammunition, with no more than a minute's worth of rounds available, forcing the gunners to be careful with their aim. Crew. The typical B-17 flew with a crew of 10 men. These were the pilot, co-pilot, bombardier, who operated the chin turret, the navigator, who utilized the cheek guns, engineer, who was also responsible for the dorsal turret, a radio operator, a pair of waist gunners, a tail gunner, and a ball turret gunner, arguably the worst position on the aircraft. Because the Flying Fortress was unpressurized, the crew would need to rely on external oxygen supplies, or they would pass out from lack of oxygen. To protect them from the frigid temperatures at high altitudes, they would wear wool-lined clothes and jackets, which would be heated through an internal electric heating system, since any exposed skin would be vulnerable to frostbite. They communicated with one another through an intercom system. The Norden bomb site. In order for the bombing missions of the B-17 to be effective, it needed to be able to deliver its payload accurately from high altitudes. For this reason, the Flying Fortress would be equipped with the Norden bomb site. First going into production in 1932, it replaced the Sperry 1 bomb site. There were different versions of the bomb site, but they all operated on the same basic principle. As the bomber approached its target, the bombardier, located in the nose of the aircraft, would activate the bomb site. He would input the aircraft's heading, speed, and estimates of wind speed and direction into the site's analog computer, and then align the crosshairs on the target. At this point, he was in control of the aircraft. Gyro stabilizers would keep the bomber level, and the site had an integrated bomb release mechanism, which allowed the bombardier to drop the payload the instant they were over the target, since even a few seconds delay could mean missing the target entirely. Once the bombs were dropped, the Norden bomb site would be shut off and the pilot would take over flying the aircraft once more. During this time, the bomber was the most vulnerable, since it had to stay steady and level, making it an easy target for fighters and flak guns. In spite of some admirers of the Norden site stating that it could, quote, drop a bomb in a pickle barrel, the realities of bombing runs during the chaos of combat meant that very few bombs hit their target, and large formations of bombers were necessary to ensure the destruction of the objective. Names and artwork. Like virtually all aircraft of the Second World War, crews became sentimental about their aircraft and would give them names and decorate the nose with artwork. These could range from the humorous to the risque to the sentimental. Animals, cartoon characters, pin-up models, and various other images adorned flying fortresses, adding a personal touch and a bit of levity and sentimentality to an otherwise distressing situation. The B-17 in combat. The B-17 served in virtually every theater of the conflict where the U.S. Army Air Corps was present, and was generally a well-regarded aircraft by those who served in them. In spite of its reliability and high performance, bombing missions, especially over German-occupied Europe, were particularly dangerous. B-17s would fly in what were called box formations, groupings of 9 to 12 bombers in close formation, whose machine guns could cover one another. In spite of this, early in the war, they operated outside of the limited range of fighter escorts, and once the escorts returned home, they would be swarmed by Luftwaffe fighters. In the face of fierce resistance, the B-17 gained a reputation as a robust aircraft that could endure significant punishment. Tales of bombers flying with tails blown off, damaged engines, or gaping holes ripped in the fuselage were commonplace, and these heavily damaged aircraft could still limp home. In spite of this, B-17 crews suffered appalling casualty rates. During the course of the war, of the 12,700 bombers built, over 4,700 of them were lost, roughly a 37% rate. In 1943, the life expectancy for a flying fortress and its crew was around 11 missions, well short of the 25 needed to complete a tour. In spite of these rates, the bombing missions took their toll on German industry, grinding their war machine to a standstill. The lessons learned during these missions gave rise to the B-29 Super Fortress, which rendered the B-17 obsolete. After the war was over, the surviving B-17s were still used into the 1950s for reconnaissance, training, and as a cargo plane. Of the thousands that were produced, only a few dozen flying fortresses remain intact, mostly as museum pieces, and only a handful are airworthy, and these have been grounded due to safety concerns, ending the career of one of the most famous aircraft ever to take to the skies.
The Avro Lancaster bomber. Cross-section, World War II. Flying low under the night sky, the British Avro Lancaster bomber quietly crossed the English Channel en route to Germany, taking the fight straight to the heart of the country for the final 3 years of World War II. The inception of the Lancaster. The British Avro Lancaster was a heavy bomber that was primarily used as a nighttime bomber during World War II and spearheaded the Allied strategic bombing campaign devised by RAF Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command Arthur Bomber Harris against Nazi Germany. Intended as the answer to issues with the Avro Manchester, the Lancaster was designed by Roy Chadwick and the Avro team, with the first prototype deploying in January 1941. A year later, in March 1942, it was used operationally for the first time, in a production run that lasted until 1946. Needing a 7-man crew, over 7,377 Lancasters were built, requiring a massive 1.1 million men and women involved in its production across 920 companies. Only 3,445 Lancasters survived the war, as they usually only managed 21 missions before being lost in action. Although its most instrumental and important period of use was during the war, the Lancaster was refitted, updated, and improved after the war, continuing its use by the RAF Bomber Command and Royal Canadian Air Force, conducting, among other things, aerial surveys and long-distance flights. By the time it was retired in 1954 and replaced by the better-developed Avro Lincoln, 15 variants on the original design had been created. Now, only 17 Lancasters remain, with only 2 capable of flight. One of them flies in formation with a Spitfire and Hurricane in the Battle of Britain memorial flight at air shows in Britain and special events. A Lancaster Mk1 composition. The Lancaster bomber measured 69 feet 6 inches in length, had a wingspan of 102 feet, and stood at 20 feet 6 inches in height off the ground. Weight. The Lancaster was heavier than the average plane, and much heavier than the standard German bomber at the time, weighing over 2 times as much. When empty, the plane was approximately 36,900 pounds, or 16,738 kilos, but was capable of carrying almost its whole weight again, being able to haul 33,100 pounds, or 15,114 kilos in fuel and bombs. This also meant that it was one of the only planes capable of carrying the RAF's largest bombs, including the deadly 12,000-pound bunker busters. These features also allowed the Dam Busters raid, codenamed Operation Chastise, to take place, which wouldn't have been possible without the Lancaster's superior bomb-holding capacity. Modified to fit British engineer Barnes Wallace's bouncing bomb underneath the fuselage, it was the only plane capable of carrying out the mission, thanks to its elongated bomb bay. Engines. The Lancaster was powered by 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin XX V12 liquid-cooled piston engines, driving 3-bladed propeller units. Each could produce up to 1,280 horsepower and 954 kilowatts of power. This meant that at 15,000 feet it could cruise at 200 miles per hour, but also had a top speed of 275 miles per hour. 6 fuel tanks were located in the wings and could hold 2,154 gallons of fuel between them, so this averaged out at nearly 1 gallon used per mile. With a bomb load of 7,000 pounds, its range was a lengthy 2,530 miles, and the Lancaster had a service ceiling of 24,500 feet, a huge improvement over the Manchester's Avro engine. But as the war went on, engine production became more difficult due to a shortage of supplies, and was forced to turn elsewhere to the British Hercules' variant of the Lancaster, which used air-cooled radial engines instead. However, these were vastly inferior, so the issue was finally resolved by importing brand new Merlin engines from the US after they had joined the war. This popular variant of the Merlin engine was also used in several other RAF aircraft, including the Hawker Hurricane and Spitfire fighter planes. Bomb sights. Initially, Lancasters used the Mark IX course-setting bomb sight, also known as CSBS. This was a rudimentary design that had been in production since its creation by Harry Wimperis in 1917. It involved squinting through wires that had to be manually set, meaning they lacked flexibility and the ability to easily change and adapt. But by 1943, this was replaced by the Mark XIV vector-based bomb sight, now recognized as the first modern bomb sight. It allowed the bomb aimer to input information at the start of the flight and a computer to automatically and continuously calculate the trajectory of the bombs and adjust accordingly during missions. This was instrumental in making the Lancaster a big-time part of the nighttime bombing raids. Crew. Something that is often forgotten in the war films and the media is the actual age of the average soldier. Although slightly older than those on foot, bomber crews were made up of 7 barely adult men with an average age of just 22. They each had their own role in flying the plane. The pilot, of course, flew the plane and assumed the leadership role, while the engineer who looked after the engine sat next to him. Behind them sat the navigator and wireless operator, who plotted the plane's course and monitored radio messages respectively. The other 3 crewmen operated the weapons. There was the bomb aimer, who sat at the front and doubled as the nose gunner, guiding the plane into position, and the final 2 operated as the rear and mid gunners. Of the crew, the rear gunner was the least likely to survive as he was physically separated from his parachute, meaning that in the event of a bailout, he needed to both access and correctly put his parachute on before exiting the Lancaster. Armament. The Lancaster was armed with 8.303-inch caliber Browning machine guns across 3 hydraulically powered turrets. 2 sat in the nose turret, 2 in the dorsal spine, and 4 in the powered tail turret. Unlike the American bombers, the Lancaster excluded the addition of a ventral belly turret, although a few variants did have one, but these were phased out by 1942 as they were not very successful. Bomb load. As already mentioned, the Lancaster's true uniqueness lay in its bomb-carrying abilities, outstripping any other plane in the World War II aviation sphere and allowing for superior nighttime raids and attacks over German soil. In total, the Lancaster had a 33-foot-long bomb bay and was capable of carrying a 14,000-pound bomb load at a speed of 200 miles per hour. This also meant it was able to carry some of the largest high-capacity cookie bombs, weighing between 1,000 and 4,000 pounds. Alongside these, the Lancaster would carry high-explosive, general-purpose, medium-case, or smaller incendiary bombs, such as 24 30-pound or 236 4-pound incendiary bombs. Later, they started modifying the Lancaster bomb bay doors to make them capable of carrying even larger 8,000 and 12,000-pound HC cookies. The drawback of the bomb load and the bomb bay doors was the lack of an easy exit route for the crew, with the hatch being smaller than those on other aircraft and far more difficult to get out of, and almost impossible wearing a parachute. It meant that the crews of stricken Lancasters only had a 15% successful bailout rate, compared to as high as 25% in Halifax's and 50% in American bombers. Communications. With one of the Lancaster's primary occupations during the war being part of the massed nighttime bomb raids in Germany, communications between the crew of the plane and other aircraft and even base was essential. The wireless operator, who sat behind the navigator, monitored radio and communications, as the plane had a radio receiver and separate transmitter that could be used for voice and Morse code messages. Part of his job would involve identifying friend or foe in the night sky and giving false signals to confuse or derail the enemy. If they entered active combat, part of his role would also be acting as a lookout through the plexiglass canopy at the back of the cockpit, in order to notify the pilot and gunners of any enemy aircraft activity. The rear gunner was also instrumental here, as the Germans often attacked from behind, meaning it was he who would see them first and be tasked with alerting the rest of the crew. The pilot would often then guide the plane into a corkscrew turn to avoid enemy fire. During the late 1940s, the RAF continued to use the Lancaster to carry out reconnaissance and aerial surveys of Central and East Africa. It was finally superseded by the development of the Avro Lincoln, which was essentially a refined version of the Lancaster. But it wasn't until December 1953 that the final Bomber Command Lancaster was retired, and the final Reconnaissance Lancaster in service for the RAF also retired less than a year later in 1954. Overhauled Lancasters continued to be used by 4 squadrons in the French naval aviation for another 10 years on reconnaissance and search and rescue missions before finally being retired.
At Simple History, we've been working with talented artists on something truly special, a collection of official, premium wall art that captures history's most incredible characters. These aren't just amazing pieces of art, they're timeless treasures designed to inspire and spark conversations for years to come. As a thanks to you, our amazing Simple History community, we're offering an exclusive 25% off these prints. Unlike fleeting trends or short-lived crazes, these prints are designed to be timeless, a lasting treasure you'll proudly display for years to come. They're perfect for any space. Imagine them on the walls of a classroom where they'll inspire students and spark meaningful discussions. Or picture them in your home or office where they'll show off your love of history with sophistication. Don't miss your chance to own one. Click the link in the description below now.